Welcome, attendees. Thank you for joining us for this Folk Unlocked panel. My name is Jennifer Rowe. My pronouns are she, her, and I am Folk Alliance International's Director of Operations. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge the importance, complexity, and difficulty of land acknowledgements in the context of online organizing, creation, and collaboration. I am grateful to join you from Kansas City on the traditional territories of the ancestral indigenous land of the Osage, Kansa, Kickapoo, and Oceti-Sakowin nations. We recognize and honor their elders past, present, and emerging. If you'd like to share a land acknowledgement of where you are joining us from, or to simply comment on the conversation, please do so in the chat box. If you're unsure of what Indigenous nation to acknowledge, you can enter your address on the native-land.ca website, which we have just posted in the chat. The following interview will be available for viewing after today's session on the Folk Alliance International YouTube channel. This session is entitled The Wisdom of the Elders. Originally conceived and programmed by longtime FAI attendee Sonny Ochs, the intent of the session is to share and celebrate the stories of the community figures who blaze trails for all of us. Past participants have included Tom Rush, Holly Neer, Cy Kahn, Josh White Jr., and Peggy Seeger. Here today to lead the interview is WXPN host and producer, Ian Zolitor.
Well, hello, folkies. I'm here from Philadelphia, the native land of the Lenape people. And first off, you may be wondering, who is that lucky guy up there or lucky schlub up there with those prominent, talented, beautiful folk musicians? Well, as Jennifer said, my name is Ian Zolitor. I host the Folk Show on WXPN in Philadelphia, which is a weekly folk music radio program. I need to take just a second here to acknowledge the passing of someone who is very important to me, my friend and mentor, as I'm sure he was to many of you. I know I wouldn't be here today if not for Gene Shea. I'm not sure that this conference would even be happening if not for Gene Shea. We lost Gene this past April from COVID-19 related complications. So it is my honor to moderate this panel in his memory. Okay, elders. One of the best resources we have in our folk community that I don't see really in other communities of music is the accessibility of our role models and really the generosity and the willingness of them to share their lessons with us and really impart wisdom that is only gained from a healthy career of both successes and failures. So it is an honor to be here virtually with Bill Staines, Pura Fé, and Vance Gilbert. I welcome the three of you to jump into the conversation at any time with questions or comments from the other panelists. Just have fun, we're all just talking. So folk scenes in every city, in every era, can differ and change very drastically. Starting with Pura Fé, could you paint us a picture of what it was like sort of starting out a folk career, if that's a thing, a folk career, in New York City in the late 80s with your band Eulalie?
Well, I'm part of growing up in New York City, you're part of the whole indigenous urban community. And that's pretty much how it sprang from there. Also being raised by singers that are from the South. My mom was also an opera singer and sang with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. So, and then going through
Wow.
having been raised in Broadway musicals and all that. So that part of me was layered on, and then being part of the Indian urban scene, you meet other Native people that are also, artists and so forth. And so we brought our commonalities together, and that's how it began. So it came out of the American Indian Community House. And yeah.
The Indian urban scene, as you call it, was it prolific back then? Were there clubs that you would all frequent, or was there an audience for all of you?
Yeah, there was a couple of places that a place called Mushrooms and another place called Phoebe's down in the like the Lower East Side. We hung out there, and then of course there were monthly powwows at the Y, and the American Indian Community House had lots of functions and things, and eventually that center became the center of so many things that came out of there, like the indigenous permanent forums that happened at the United Nations. There's the American Indian Law Alliance. There were theater groups. There was, so we were always together, congregating mostly at the American Indian Community House, and then of course all those little social places that we mostly powwows and yeah.
So something that is important to a lot of us these days, and I want you, Vance and Bill, to just think about this while I direct it again to Pura, is the idea of inclusiveness and accessibility into the folk community at large. Back then in the late 80s, did you feel that the Indian community was accepted into the larger folk community? And has that changed? Do you feel more included now?
There's always been bridges to, there's people that are part of both those, Pete Seeger, and there were so many people that were a part of our circle as well as, it's hard to say. Yes, I guess I can say yes,
Great.
Bill has a song called Bridges, so I thought he might perk up when he heard that word.
I did, actually. Perfect segue. So one cool thing about this particular panel is Bill and Vance both started or began their careers or sort of playing in a more professional context in the Boston and Cambridge area, but in different times. So Bill, let's starting with you. Cambridge in the early and mid 60s. We've heard stories. Why don't you tell us more stories? Tell us what it was like, and if the clubs were accessible to you and people like you.
Well, the Boston Cambridge scene was just really a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up musically. And of course, folk music back in the 60s was one of the popular music genres. I mean, there was rock and roll and the Beach Boys and so forth. And then there were people like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary and so forth. And so in high school, the high school kids were listening to folk music and as well as rock and roll. But there were these two parties, if you will. And I was part of the folk music scene. And we had a fretted strings instrument club and at our school. And most of the kids that were in high school were playing Phil Ochs and Tom Paxton and Joan Baez and so forth. And so at 3:00 in the afternoon, I would throw my books into the locker, and I was an okay student, not a great student, but I'd head off to the coffee houses at nighttime. And the one thing about the coffee houses in Boston and Cambridge were they were a real social scene. In other words, you could come into town and be an unknown and play at the Turk's Head or the Orleans that later became the Sword and Stone or the Loft or someplace else. And these were all coffee houses on Charles Street. And then there were places like the Unicorn and the Club 47. The Unicorn was in Boston. And that was pretty much on the par with the Club 47, just different city. And so even if you weren't known and you were playing and got invited to play at the Turk's Head, say, the place would be at least 3/4 full because it was a social scene. It was where everybody went to hear whatever music was being sung. And then if you had something to offer people, then you began to develop a following. And so, and then if you were really lucky, at some point you got to play the Club 47 or the Unicorn, which obviously with people were playing like Ian and Sylvia and Phil Ochs and Dave Van Ronk and a whole bunch of people. The other thing about it was on WBZ in Boston, there was a folk show. And it started out with a fellow by the name of Jefferson Kay. And Jefferson Kay would come around and host some of the hootenannies that were going on. He was really involved. He was also the afternoon DJ for Top 40, but he loved folk music and would come to the clubs in Boston. And so it's just a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up and go and hear people that later became, I think Jerry Corbett got me my first job, and Jerry Corbett and Jesse Cullen Young were Jesse and Jerry, and they became the Youngbloods. And so all these people went on to careers, that stemmed out of the Boston, Cambridge folk scene, as well as the New York folk scene and the Chicago folk scene and the San Francisco folk scene and so forth.
Well, so this sort of transition between folk music to you and maybe these other performers being sort of a social thing more than anything else, it sounds, or more for them, the transition from that into making a career of it and getting paid to play folk music. Can you tell us about that? Because I think there's a lot of people maybe watching this that are trying to make that transition themselves.
All right. Well, I think it's a lot harder nowadays because first of all, there aren't the little coffee houses around that were dedicated or are dedicated to folk music. I think that it's tell me the question again.
I was just curious about the transition from playing for, the social reasons
Sure.
to playing professionally, the barriers that were there and the ease that maybe you had because of the time that you were doing it.
Well, one of the things was that it was for me, it was a snowball effect. I've never had any great step up other than doing the Prairie Home Companion show in the early years. Mm-hmm. But so it became a snowball type of thing. In 1968, I went out to play at audition for Lena Spencer at Cafe Lena. And that was the blizzard of 68. And I couldn't make it home. And the regular performer couldn't make it to Lena's. And so she said, you know what? Why don't you just play the weekend and I'll pay you whatever comes in the door. And
so
then,
when you said snowball effect, you meant literally a snowball effect.
Yeah, really. But then a friend of mine had gotten out of the Marine Corps and he mustered out in Houston. And he said, why don't you come down and help me come back with this truck? And he said, are there a couple of coffee houses down here? And there was a place called Sand Mountain. So I went to Houston in 1970. And I ended up playing at Sand Mountain with Jerry Jeff and Towns and all of those folks. And so, and then somebody heard me at Sand Mountain, and then I went to play in Dallas and so forth. And so it was just one of these things. I got invited to a festival in Kentucky in 1972, and then it began to grow and grow and grow. And that's how it worked for me.
Thanks, Bill. It sounds like meeting people within the community seems to be very beneficial to you back then. And that's the beauty of these conferences, really. We get to meet our contemporaries, our colleagues, and hopefully all grow together. So Vance, when you when you were in the open mic scene up in Boston, Cambridge, was it different than that? Were the high school kids listening to folk music and playing Tom Paxton then?
No, they weren't. This was music that we had to go to rather than come to us. You had to really seek it out. We were, when I say we, I came out of the clutch of people that included Ellis Paul and Dar Williams and Martin Sexton and so many of the other people that came out of the late 80s, early 90s folk scene in Boston. And it was a teeming scene, no getting around it. Thanks to a couple of places. There was one place that was an alcove in Allston, Massachusetts, the Naked City Coffee House, and poets would read, people would juggle, and folk singers would sing, and many of us met the other there. And places like I remember I'm talking early 80s now, when I first made a stab at this, the venerable Sword and Stone that Bill was talking about. There was dust on the tables, and they were really about to close at that point. So coming out of the 80s was, I don't know who was playing around here at that point. I think it was 80s electronica and such, and then Tracy Chapman was on the street, and then came the clutch of people that I emanated from. And but we were rabid. There's no getting around us. We all wanted to play Club Passim, which was the ex Club 47, but many of us couldn't because we weren't a draw. So we went to the coffee house that was around the corner of, which is the name escapes me, but
Is that the name?
The Nameless.
Mhm.
Yes, yeah. Many of us would find our spots there, and which was like a big glorified open mic of sorts for people who had just enough name to maintain the attention of a handful of people that would be in there, or sometimes it would be packed. And it was a time where pop music and folk music were dovetailing, though. I will say that for those who, again, I say that were actively searching it out. Many of us were wrapping ourselves around the more acoustic work of Tom Waits and Sean Colvin and Suzanne Vega and Tracy Chapman and many of the higher profile, I guess you could call them folk, but still pretty much pop-based folks that were leading the way coming out of the 80s. And we were on those coattails. And great coattails they were. I mean, there was some work to be had if you were dulcet enough or funny enough or wrote an incisive lyric enough to be part of that. And if we were lucky enough, when someone did come through an established coffee house, you got to open for people like Bill Staines. And that was, I was relating a story earlier where this was actually out in Utah. I had opened for Bill Staines, and he was so kind to me. It was the early 90s, and he was very kind to me. And I introduced myself on stage as his long lost son after a relationship with Cicely Tyson, and my name was Ketchup. And it went over okay with the audience, and it went over fine with Bill, which is what I was most considering. But there was a paving of the way for these established characters like Bill and Utah Phillips and all these other folk people that really did pave a way and were very accepting of those of us that didn't know the Carter family, but certainly knew all of James Taylor's albums that came out of the mid 70s. So there was a lot to learn, but it was a very fertile time musically. Personally, I come from a more sort of jazz and pop, and you could even say cocktail background, but someone took me to a concert at a place called the Old Vienna Coffee House in Westboro, Massachusetts. And playing there that night was Sean Colvin. And at that point, after seeing her, I wanted to be a 5'6" white woman. And that was my goal in life, is to tour with Sean Colvin. I said, I want a gig here. And in the next 3 years, I want to open a show for Sean Colvin. Well, in a year, I was with Sean Colvin and opening her whole Fat City tour. So it was a dream come true, and I've never let it go. And that's what has brought me from absolute unknown up the ranks to relatively obscure where I am now.
Well, so without being presumptuous, you're still not a 5'6" white woman. Is that right, Vance? Um,
In my acoustic, impressionistic lyric writing heart, I am.
that's fair.
Because
We can
you see, there was a lot to shake. There was a lot to shake, you know,
Yeah.
particularly maybe it's not the forum for it, but
Uh-huh.
being an African American folk singer, acoustic singer songwriter, whatever you want to call it, there was an expectation when I stepped on the stage that I didn't help with. My goal was to be as lyrical and as red sounding as I could possibly be, and not necessarily be, oh, that's so soulful, it's so great. Oh, look at the time. We can't wait till someone with a lyric with some heart comes up here. So um, there was an evolution to my music that that followed the route of trying to like somebody like Sean Colvin that could write this incredibly impressionistic lyrical content stuff and put it in this acoustic folk format where people are sitting quietly in an audience listening. And I wasn't getting that from the jazz crowd when I was trying to do the acoustic jazz cocktail thing. I mean, if you got your way through a Duke Ellington tune on acoustic guitar singing it, you might get some kudos, but I wasn't telling my story. And this was an opportunity to tell a lot of my story. And my story involved more than doing the expected Motown covers, or more expectedly, is there racism involved here? You know, racism is out of ignorance and preconception. So if I step on a stage and people expect the blues, that's a thing, you know, or
Yeah.
if your lolly steps out somewhere to do it, and I've seen you folks, you're great. People, yeah, how many places do you go? People expect a headdress. You know, you're going to get that from time to time, but in your own personal angsty place, you work like a dog to dispel those ideas of those preconceptions about you. And so that's why, oh my God, I'm going on here. I haven't even had coffee. But when someone asks me, what do you write first? The music or the lyrics? I say lyrics, because that's the legacy I want to leave. And, you know, when I hear a performer like, and I'm proud of myself, I'll break my arm patting myself on the back. When I hear a Tom Rush or a Bill Staines, after listening to a week of Charlie Parker, I think about how consummate that music is. And I said to Tom Rush once, I was out on the road with him, and I said, I've been listening to the Dial sessions with Charlie Parker all week, and you have blown me away. And he looked at me like I had four heads. But many of you really, really old guys like Bill, you really have to understand that the swath that you cut, that I would remember this tune, Bridges. That tune was affecting to me. It spoke to this whole sea of people in front of me. And I'm watching this guy work this audience. And I was like, that's as good as the comedian Sinbad, and as good as Keith Jarrett, and wrapped all up in one. And it was musical as hell. And that when I drove back to the airport or wherever, that's what was on my mind. It wasn't Charlie Parker anymore, or Miles Davis, who would turn his back on an audience. Yeah, so, you know, as I take that amalgam in and put that stuff out there, I say, welcome to the new folk music, because this is what I'm giving to you now. I'm a little bit somewhere between, you know, now I could say somewhere between June Tabor, Maybelle Carter, and the Spinners.
I like that.
So that's the new folk music for me. You know, because I can sit in front of an audience, and they're sitting there, and I'm there with the guitar, and I'm rocking the house. That is folk music.
Absolutely. Well, So, and thank you, Vance, and Pura. The I'd love for you to sort of chime in here too about the idea of expectations. The expectations that maybe you encounter once you step on stage, coming from a certain culture, versus maybe the music that you're also drawn to, blues and jazz, as we know that you're inspired by.
Um, the expectations. Well, I'm inspired by like roots music from everywhere, traditional music
Hmm.
from every part of the world. So, but and that alone, people wouldn't expect. Um, but expectations usually pretty simple. They don't expect harmony, and um, they don't expect us, for whatever it is that we are. We anywhere we went, all over the world, we would show up with these hand drums, and we would walk up on the stage, and they would just roll their eyes. Usually, these guys that would help the techies, and they'd just be looking at us and like, oh, as soon as we put these mics on, we can walk away. But then we would just like just wail and power and ancestors, and they were not expecting that. And they have a mindset of what is indigenous pretty much from anywhere. So I don't know if I'm really giving you any meat here, but I don't want to take too much time. um, a lot of people just don't expect us to be musical and to be able to connect and deliver something that's real, that's ancestral, and just, feels good, sounds good,
Hmm.
and has power and has content and messages. They don't expect any of that. So,
Well, so when you're there, playing the music that you feel, speaking your truth through the music, uh, how do you retain that audience that maybe wasn't expecting that? Is there something specific that you could think of that you try to address right off the bat?
no,
Hmm.
we just sit down and we begin.
Yeah.
And it's a journey, and everyone's on it. And we're all together, and so we just give everything we got, and it's always been good. We haven't been together for a long time. We all do separate things.
Mhm.
So and but right now we're actually putting something together with Buffy, Bonnie, um Indigo Girls, the Day Sisters, for the Pipeline 3, going through the Mississippi over
Oh,
up
yeah.
in Minneapolis. So, trying to stop it. So, I mean, that's basically where so much of our music goes into that.
Mhm.
Constantly having to speak or be a voice for the environment and for the people.
Is that tiresome? Do you wish
Yeah.
that maybe that wasn't expected of you to be the advocate for the earth?
No, I mean, we're supposed to be, right, all
Yeah,
day.
I
So,
would hope so. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, just fighting it in front lines. It's like it's a way of it's like right outside my door is front is a front line. So, yeah.
Well, so activism, through music, which I think is a great use of our genre, our art form here in the folk community, is to make positive change in the world. So, Pura, in your career so far, can you tell us about some of the ebb and flow of the activism, maybe the receptiveness of that activism through the music?
Um, Gee, I don't know how to answer that. Um, I mean, you certainly can do a lot with music. You can really, it's like honey, right? So you can definitely You can change people, you can educate people, you can sway. I mean, even politicians ask us to come and be a part of their campaign. So that means something, yes.
Yeah.
And
It's Like Honey is phenomenal. Oh my God.
I've been thinking about that. Yeah.
It's so great. It's not,
Yeah.
you don't just take a big spoonful of it and walk away. It's used for things. It's like, wow.
yeah.
Hell, I'm writing that down. Where's my? It's Like Honey.
So, well, then, Bill, let me ask you. Starting out in the '60s, and you mentioned Tom Paxton, and there are other people that wrote topical songs. I'm sure were in that crowd with you. How have you noticed? What changes have you personally noticed in the receptiveness of topical music? I don't know, for lack of a better term.
Well, there is always an ear for people bringing up the problems that we have. And I've never been really a topical singer. I have very strong feelings about a lot of the stuff that's going on around us, as does everybody. But I've always kept politics and issues, if you will, out of my music. Stepping back just a little bit, what Pura said, I think music, to me, is probably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful force in the world. I think that through music, we can accomplish amazing, amazing things. One of the things when I'm writing a song, and I'm very cognizant of this, is I want to bring something of value to people. I want to open up their eyes a little bit and expose their own beings to themselves, and so that's what I try and do, and I think that's important, and I think people want to hear that. With all due respect to my partners here, I guess I would say that I don't really feel comfortable singing songs about the problems. I really feel more comfortable singing songs about the answers. And that's what I think would take a song a lot farther along down the road.
Well, so writing the songs about the answers, I mean, writing songs geared towards children's music, I think, is a beautiful way to sort of conduct that and instilling on the future generations some of the possibilities with, of these answers and a better way forward. How did you, what made you transition maybe in the start writing children's music?
I never did, really.
Uh-huh.
I mean, some of the songs that I've written are sung by kids, but I mean, I wrote this song called "A Place in the Choir," and that was really, I wrote it in about 10. There are 2 or 3 stages to songwriting. The first stage is the conceptual stage, and then the second stage, and that's the hardest part. And once you have a concept for the song, then the second stage is the craft stage, and that's when you sit down and you bring that concept to fruition. So, "A Place in the Choir" is all God's critters have a place in the choir. Well, that was the concept, and the song was. I mean, I could have written 400 verses to that song, and it was written in like 10 minutes. And my wife came home from work, and I said, "What do you think of this song?" And she went, and I played it the next day or the next night in Fredonia, New York, and everybody jumped on it. And I thought, this is bizarre,
I have to stop you. I got to stop you. I'm sorry. That song is a far more revolutionary than you think it is. Because just by very nature of saying that all these things have a place in the choir, each one of those, that is, it's gender accepting. It long before its time,
right.
it was doing those things. And I would imagine you managed to put together a song that poked people into the idea of accepting people without pissing people off. And I don't know how you did that, because most revolutionary music should piss people off a little bit.
Right.
But I imagine somebody driving home from a Bill Staines concert saying, I think I'm going to call my gay son, because by golly, I think, it's more revolutionary than you think, Bill, just because you're not like throwing down bolts of thunder at someone.
Right.
That song, I've seen people glow at that song, and it means that they're going to go out into their world and change their world because of that song.
Right.
Yeah.
That next day, that's what happens. That's exactly what happens with Eulally's music. They, with just the fact that you were talking about the sound people go like, wow, this is the real deal.
Mhm.
If you move the sound people while they're setting up, your evening's done. No one gives a shit about what happens with the audience at that point, because you took 4 or 5 jaded people who have seen everything, and they're back at a bar somewhere going like, these guys were smoking.
Mm.
These people were unbelievable. And that's what that song does. So whatever you just said, Bill, is a lie. Go ahead. I'm through.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I guess I never really even realized what the song was when it was written.
Oh,
You know, and I mean, it wasn't written for that specific. It was just simply a bunch of animals in an orchestra. But as it turns out, it became so much more than that. And
isn't that the best songs? Aren't they the best songs?
yeah.
What kind of audience did you have in mind, Bill, when you wrote that? Were you thinking of anyone that song could possibly be geared towards, or
No,
was that not a thought?
Actually, I was playing a little sort of a Cajun instrumental on my guitar. And it was like a fiddle tune type of rhythm. It was like dun 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 dun. God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low, and it just came out of me.
Nice.
I mean, that line literally just came out of me, and I remember a group from Canada recorded it sometime later. And I thought, they are doing this song way too fast. And then I listened to my recordings of the song, and I'm doing it twice as fast as they are. And so I did learn something from my friend Mason Daring, that if you sing a song for a long time, one of the things you have to be careful of when you go into the studio, when you sing a song for a long time, the way that it keeps, the way you keep it young is to sing it faster and faster. And you have to, when you go into the studio, you have to be really careful that you're not speeding it up too much from the original concept of the song.
That's good advice to all the musicians watching. Just
Right.
some good solid advice for when you do go into a studio. Thanks, Bill.
Right.
And full disclosure, a place in the choir when I was a very small kid, just a wee little lad, was a huge hit in my household. One that my mom would play on guitar and we'd all sing because it's in Rise Up Singing, right? I think.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah. So Vance, do you have an audience in mind when you were writing songs? And does that change from song to song? Or is that not something that you think about?
I have an audience in mind. I not only have an audience in mind, sometimes I imitate other songwriters and thinking about what their audience might be. And maybe this song would be in the pantheon of what they're doing. But yeah, I think in terms of, to be honest, I think, how would this song sound in the middle of my set at Club Passim, in the middle of the second set? How is this song going to sit up? And I think the same thing is this song something that I could potentially deliver at the Falcon Ridge Folk Festival? So I kind of place it in places, and that that's for for good or bad, is there really a lot of honesty in that writing? What are you writing for? Well, that's a big ass question. What indeed am I writing for? And I do think in terms of performance, I need the song to be doable. I will write something from time to time that is harder for me to play than average, because I think that's the only way that I improve. And my personal improvement in something is important. But yeah, sure, there's an audience at play when I'm putting down lyrics and chords. Sure.
It seems that the audience is something that you definitely do consider, maybe when writing, but then also when performing. One of the most highly attended workshops at any of these conferences is when you prepare up and coming musicians for their time on stage. In fact, that was the first workshop I've ever attended in any Folk Alliance conference. Was at the Northeast Regional. Me and Gene just drove up from Philly, and we didn't even check into the room. He said, Vance's workshop started. We got to go. And it was amazing how you would take so much time and effort and care to just impart whatever you could on people that are just trying to do what they can to play music, and sharing everything you got with them. Why is that important to you, Vance, to share your secrets?
Well, I'll put a finer point on that question. Why is it important to me? Clearly, it's important to them to get their story out. No matter what that story is, if you can perform it cleanly and clearly and without a lot of distraction and histrionic that doesn't have to do with your performance of that song, then your legacy gets left, and in no uncertain terms. And isn't that why we're all here? Why it's more important to me is it's kind of half joking, but it's a little self-serving too, but I think it's the real deal. If a fledgling performer is frequenting this open mic at this coffee house or playing the off nights, and they and for lack of a better term, not to be too judgmental, they perform poorly, or they do all the typical folk things that make it people looking at their watch folk music, then when Eulalie or Bill Staines comes to town that weekend, people say, should we go see that? That place, the people just come and they tuck their chin in their chest and sing. I don't feel like going to that. But I feel it's a tide that raises all ships. If people are performing and singing well, then the whole genre of this music, this acoustic music thing, becomes more illuminated than that. God save us, the scene from Animal House where the John Belushi's coming down the stairs and he grabs the guitar from the guy who's playing I Gave Him a Love a Cherry and breaks it over something and goes, I feel better, and keeps walking. I mean, that's what folk music is looked at by a lot of people. And that guy playing the guitar there was Stephen Bishop. Who had hits with acoustic guitars. So that's why that's important. And these other two performers here are consummate at that. And you watch them do what they do on stage, their message is getting across because all their other performance facades and BS are out of the way. They're performers, and that's why it's important. And if I can impart that on the next generation, or even the older generation that is wondering why the same old thing that they do isn't happening, then my job is done. And I make hundreds and hundreds of dollars doing it yearly.
Pura, do you think about the future generations that will come and people that will be playing folk music or indigenous music after you? Do you feel compelled to teach them some of your techniques, or have them follow closely your relationship to the future generations of musicians? Sorry, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So I said, I certainly share what I have. Absolutely, probably everything. And not only to Indigenous youth, but like I like sharing my canoe songs. I sing them everywhere. I teach them everywhere. For me, that is about teamwork, unification. It's about life source and water, and the singing is our breath. I mean, to me, that's where as I get older, those things are so important. And breath of life is what we share, So, yeah, so that's what I give. And since I moved to Canada, I'm away from my own community in North Carolina, my people, and but that's pretty much what I mean. Everyone, these kids, they're born with all of that in them anyway. They just unfold, and I mean, we don't really change in terms of the information that we're born with in our DNA. It just keeps coming. So they're a lot smarter, I think. And yeah, so I share what I have, everything actually.
That's wonderful and generous of you. So, you all three, the three of you and other people, I mean, we're not nearly talking to the first few generations of elders. There are people that have come before us and, for many, many generations. So I'm curious, Pura, who were, when you were playing music or starting out playing music, who were your elders? Who did you look to maybe for some guidance, musically or spiritually in this career?
Just people to play with, people to share with were the ones that I really seeked after. I mean, I grew up in a family of like 8 generations of singers, of women singers.
Wow.
And it's coming from our Tuscarora lineage out of North Carolina. And that alone is it's an old line of food, soul food. And so when you're born in a family of singers and they sing together and there's harmony, and then you're exposed in New York with all this other kind of stuff, and it wasn't just blues and jazz for me, it was folk, and it was also like flamenco and fusion. I'm a fusion head. And and then you grow up in a school with other students that were also musicians. So you're always in a basket of music and characters and people and genres, and it just gets stirred around, and somehow or another you make your own way. I mean, I really don't have a specific cut formula of anything. It just kind of happens. I mean, I did have specific influences. Probably one of the biggest ones was my grandmother, Easter. Her name is Easter Monk, Easter
My
Sanders
grandmother
Monk.
was named Easter too.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, on my dad's side, yeah. And Pura, then sorry for your loss in the last week if you're a fusion head, because we lost
Yeah,
Korea.
Chick.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
a shame for a lot of us that were into that music for sure.
Yes. Right. But one last thing I'll just say is that folk music and indigenous music for sure have always been side by side.
Sure.
Yeah. So
That's so great that music, it sounds like, was always part of your life in your household for generations, just in your family. Very fortunate. Did you feel fortunate that was always around you, or it was just everyday life you didn't notice?
both.
Mhm.
And also, you know, when I finally went home and moved down home, you notice in all the Indian communities, they all sing like this. They all sing harmony and they sing together. And that's because they're from the water, you know. So I realized at that point that my family was not that unique, that I come from a whole culture of that. So I don't know if you saw the movie Rumble, but there's a slice of that in there, kind of giving you that sound and that idea. But anyway,
Very cool.
yeah.
Well, so Bill, when you were starting out, from what I can gather, it's before my time, believe it or not, the early '60s. But
A lot of people say.
there was a big notion of just collecting old songs and just finding old folk songs wherever you could. People were going back to source material in a lot of these folk scenes in the Northeast, going back to field recordings. The anthology of American folk music, for example, I'm sure was passed around a lot of those places. So who were your elders? Were there people that were doing that were playing music that you wanted to play, that were doing something that you said that you wanted to do, and you would look to them?
Well, when I was in junior high school, we had a little band, a little rock and roll band, and it was myself and the Curtis brothers, John and Dick Curtis, and we were rehearsing one day in their basement, and Mrs. Curtis came down and said, "You should listen to this recording." And it was the Weavers at Carnegie Hall. It was the original version of the Weavers of Carnegie Hall. And immediately we gave up our little electric guitars and picked up banjos and so forth. And in fact, John Curtis still plays. Vance, you probably know John. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
John still plays on a lot of my albums. Wonderful musicians, but I've known him since junior high school. I'd like to make a couple of points. First of all, when you're talking about folk music, I think that what makes something a folk song, if you will, is people don't have to sing Barbary Allen their whole life. But in order for something for me to be a folk song, it's a song that's much larger than the person who wrote it. And I use examples like the Mary Ellen Carter, Stan Rogers song. I mean, that's a celebration of the human spirit that we all have. These are great songs. These are songs about love and home and work and living and dying. And so when there's a song that's much bigger than the person who wrote it, the possibility of it becoming a folk song is there. And I think, you know, there are so many of those songs, you know, that are they just celebrate the human spirit. And that is what I think, you know, whether it be indigenous, you know, with people recalling their elders. I mean, that's a celebration of the human spirit. And therefore it's folk music, you know.
I love that.
When if you can write beyond yourself, that's when I think that you can reach people, and your songs will stay around for a while. And it's just, you know, I tell people, I want you to write great songs, hopefully in a you know, not, you know, hopefully in a, I can't think
Uplifting?
of hopefully in, you know, in value or in quality, you know, write great songs, hopefully in quality, but more than that, songs about things that everybody knows, the great things in life. And you know, when it comes my turn again, ask me about being nervous on stage.
Well, I just want to throw in there the idea of writing a song that's bigger than yourself. And you mentioned the Mary Ellen Carter. I read an anecdote real quick about there was an actual that's a made up story by Stan Rogers, but there was an actual shipwreck, and the crew, when they were in the water, they were just singing that song and rise again, and they credit that song with keeping them alive until they were rescued.
I've heard that story.
Yeah,
I've heard that story.
songs that are bigger than yourself, folks. I love it. So I want to address something or ask a question. I guess we could start with Vance here. That comes up at these conferences sometimes. Touring and playing music professionally is not necessarily the healthiest lifestyle. And there might be people out here watching that want to live to be elders themselves one day. So what advice can you give people to stay healthy in mind and body doing what they're doing?
Well, they're not here. They're in the other room because they're wet. First one is 1 or 2 good supportive pairs of running shoes. I am consistently overweight. The chart says obese, but there haven't been many days in the last 30 years that I haven't gone more than 2 or 3 days without going for a run. I run incessantly. And I'm on an upswing right now where I do 3 to 5 a day because I'm trying to get that big D off of my chart, the diabetes one, which is unfortunately kind of more genetically endemic to Black and Native populations. But I'm fighting the fight, and I figure if I could drop a whole bunch of weight, that would do it. That's one of the things, is to stay healthy. I also don't drink. I've never had a drink, so that's foreign to me. Nor have I ever done drugs, and that's one of the things. If I can stay healthy, I can stay on the road and do this thing.
Do you find opportunity on the road easily enough to get out and run?
Yeah, I think if you could get yourself to do it, you have. I generally check into a hotel or motel right, before the show, and I go back to that hotel or motel, and checkout is usually at 11 o'clock, and hopefully I'm not driving such a maddening distance that I can't get up at 9:45 and go out and do a half hour or even 20 minutes or something before you get in the car. Well, now I do that and I stretch because I'm older. I'm not as old as Bill, like I said, but I still have to get out and stretch and keep myself together. Now, if you saw me, I don't look like a runner. I look heavy, and this body, man, this temple. Let's just say it's a good thing I sing because it's not pretty, but
you're doing something right. I'll tell you.
I take it with me. I take it out there, and I go when. And I think that's the biggest thing. Eating wise, I think I eat. I stay away from. I don't do red meat. Keep dairy at bay, and buffet Chinese is a problem for me. I don't know if there's any support groups for it, but that's
I'll join if there is.
And it's worse with the phone because you could just say you can drive and say buffet Chinese. And the car automatically turns to that part of town where that is. But staying healthy to stay on the road is a tantamount to. I think you can gain it. I can gain a decade. I'm convinced of it. I have friends of mine my age that I see them dragging their asses after a couple days on the road, and I'm ready to be home, but I can handle it. Because I come to it healthily.
Well, Pura, do you have tips as well to keep yourself healthy in body and mind? And was that always something that you thought of? Is that something that you think of when you're on the road?
Of course, to stay away from those little buffet things with all those sweets and things backstage. I'm always telling my little grandkids here, that you have to eat something that's alive every day. You have to eat living food like greens and fruits and vegetables that raw and raw foods. I say that we have to eat that and not processed foods. But I live in the boreal forest. I'm right on the tree line. So when it comes to those seasons where we go and we gather lots of tea, lots of medicines, and so we drink that all year round, and sap and roots, and we boil and steam all kinds of twigs and leaves, and that usually keeps us very healthy. Try not to eat any processed foods, but we eat a lot of moose meat, deer meat. There's a lot of fish. Yeah, well, if you're on the road, I think it's best to just, if you can, take a little tiny juicer thing, a little, mega bullet or whatever they're called. Take that with you and juice lots of foods. I think that'll help keep the pipes clean. So
That sounds good. And that
Yeah.
sounds like an easy thing that, you could just bring along with you. Why not?
yeah, that and tea. You'll
Yeah.
be good.
That and tea. And then we also have in this panel the Energizer Bunny of folk music, Bill Staines, who plays 475 shows a year, I think.
Wow.
What
Not quite.
how do you have the where does the stamina come from to keep that up after all these years?
Well, first of all, you wouldn't want to know my diet. It's just the opposite of everybody else here. And I never drink before I play, and I don't drink and drive or anything like that. But after a while, when I need to be responsible, I'm responsible. When I don't need to be responsible, then I'm not responsible. But the thing about the road is there's, every day to me is like, something can happen to you. I mean, it may be bad, but hopefully not. But every day is an opportunity to have something come into your life. I call them little victories. And you may get a phone call from somebody that's going to record one of your songs, or it may be, it doesn't have to be material, although sometimes somebody gave me a book that was signed by Charles Lindbergh because I wrote a song about the Lindberghs. I said, I can't take this, and they said, I have tons of stuff because they were related in some way to the Lindberghs. But anyway, it's and so every day is an opportunity for something, some little victory to come and sit in your lap. At the end of the day, probably 98% of the time, nothing's happened, but there's always tomorrow. And so I'm always looking forward to the next day when something good might happen. And that keeps you young, and it keeps you going on the road because you don't know what's around the next corner.
That's beautiful, Bill. Well, we have really just a few minutes left. Somehow this time really flew by, but if you can all think about maybe one last piece of wisdom that you want to use this opportunity to instill upon everyone watching, future generations or people of your generation that are watching, what would that be? Vance, do you in 1 minute, what's your most wise thing?
If you have that blender and you put buffet Chinese in it, take the shell off of the shrimp first. That's all I ask. Do not use it, what she said, but without the shell on the shrimp. I think the greatest advice I could give those that are coming up is to listen up. Just continue listening, and realize that there are a lot of notes there. You don't have to sing all of them, and tell your story, and tell your story with less.
Yeah, very good. Tell your story with less. Pura, thinking about people that are watching this right now, what would you tell them? What would be your parting wisdom?
Don't let line 3 come through the pipeline.
Yeah,
Not to be
like that.
afraid, not to be afraid to say what you feel, not to be afraid to express, not to be afraid of anything, of the government. Yeah, just stand up and be proud of human pride. Yeah, those kind of things. I really
Thank
believe in
you,
that.
Jared. I could use that today. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This is some really great advice. Bill, can you live up to that? I'm sure you can. What do you have to say to people out here right now?
Well, for a lot of people come up to me and they'll say, do you ever get nervous on stage? And I think back to a book that I read by David Amram called Vibrations. It was written in 1967, and I'm sure you all know who David Amram is.
Oh yeah.
And the tenet of the book is never think more of yourself than you do of your music. There it is right there. Never think more of yourself than you do of your music. And when it comes down to being nervous on stage, you think you're going to fail. You think you're going to not make people happy. You think you're going to not sound good. And all that is it's just thinking more about yourself. And if you just get up there and do what you do, I'll give you one example. Quickly, I was at the I think it was 85 Winnipeg Folk Festival, and was a group there called the Original Sloth Band, and they had about 7 or 8 people up on stage doing gospel, rock, folk stuff, and they just tore the place apart. And the person after them was Brian Bowers on his auto harp. And Brian stepped up to the microphone, and people were still cheering for the band. And he said, I want to play for you the old Wildwood Flower. Now, he could have said, here's a Carter family song or whatever, but he just said, I want to play for you the old Wildwood Flower. And he started playing, and that audience just went just like that. And he had that audience just in the palm of his hands for the rest of the set. And so don't think more of yourself than you do of your music, because it's the music that's important. It's not you. It's the music that's important, and it's what you have to say.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Bill. Thanks to all of you, Vance Gilbert and Bill Staines and Pura Fé. This has been incredible. Still a wealth of useful information and interesting stories, fascinating, wisdom that you've all been so generous for sharing. So thank you all so much for this.
Thanks, Ian, for the questions.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Ian. Thanks.
my pleasure. Jennifer is going to come back on here in just a second, but I want to thank Sam, our engineer today. This is, I'm sure, a whole new ball game with the conference online. So you did a great job, Sam. And Felice and Alyssa, our ASL interpreters. Thank you both very much. Yeah. And thanks also to Angus and Michelle for helping put this workshop together. And Jennifer, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, Vance, Pura, and Bill. This session will continue to be available as a recording on Folk Unlocked platform all week. Please take a moment to provide feedback about today's conversation by posting comments in the chat. And then finally, Folk Unlocked is made available at a pay what you are able price point, thanks to the generosity of donors. If you'd like to support our work, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. Stay safe and connected, community. See you soon.